Cedar Hollow wasn't the kind of town that showed up on postcards. It didn't have a charming main street lined with flower boxes or a clock tower that chimed every hour. What it did have was rain, lots of it, and a quiet kind of weariness that settled into the bones of its buildings and its people alike. The kind of place where everyone knew your business, but no one really saw you unless you made noise. Tucked behind a row of shuttered storefronts, past a rusted gas pump that hadn't worked in 20 years, sat a small garage with peeling green paint and a sagging roof. That's where he lived. Not by choice, but because it was all he could afford after everything fell apart. The garage had once belonged to a mechanic who'd retired to Florida and never came back. Now it was home to a man most folks barely noticed. Just another shadow moving through the fog of early mornings and late nights. He wasn't always like this. Years ago, he'd been known around town as one of the best carpenters in the county. People would drive from 3 towns over just to have him build their kitchen cabinets or restore their old porch railings. His hands were steady, his eye for detail sharp, and he never cut corners. He took pride in making things that lasted, but pride doesn't pay hospital bills. It happened on a Tuesday. He was working on a custom bookshelf for a lawyer in the next county over. The ladder slipped. He fell backward, landed hard on his lower back, and heard something pop, a sound he'd never forget. The pain came fast and didn't leave. Doctors called it a herniated disc with nerve damage. Surgery was an option, but expensive. Insurance covered part of it, but not enough. He tried to work through it at first, but lifting a 2x4 sent lightning down his leg. Eventually, he couldn't hold a hammer without wincing. Bills piled up. Savings vanished. The small house he'd bought with his wife before she left, saying she couldn't watch him disappear into pain and silence, was sold to cover medical debt. He moved into the garage because the owner, an old friend, let him stay for free as long as he kept the place tidy and fixed the leaky gutter every spring. Now, his days followed a quiet rhythm. He woke before sunrise, brewed weak coffee on a hot plate, and walked into town with a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. Some days he'd help Mrs. Callahan carry her groceries. Other days he'd rake leaves for the high school principal or patch a hole in someone's fence for $10 and a sandwich. He never asked for more. He didn't want pity. He just wanted to keep moving, even if it was one slow step at a time. People in Cedar Hollow didn't talk to him much. Not out of meanness exactly, more out of habit. He'd become part of the background, like the old water tower or the cracked sidewalk near the post office. Kids sometimes pointed and whispered, "That's the broke carpenter," as if broke was his name. Adults would nod politely if they passed him on the street, but their eyes slid away quickly, as if looking too long might remind them of how fragile their own lives really were. He didn't mind the silence. In fact, he preferred it. Words had lost their weight after the fall. What was there to say? "I'm fine" felt like a lie. "I'm not okay" felt like begging. So he stayed quiet, kept his head down, and focused on the small things. The smell of sawdust, he still kept a few scraps in a tin box. The sound of rain on the garage roof. The way the morning light hit the oak tree outside his window. Then, one April morning, everything changed, not with a bang, but with the return of someone the town hadn't seen in nearly a decade. The Winthrop estate sat on the hill overlooking Cedar Hollow, a grand old house with tall windows, ivy-covered stone walls, and a wraparound porch that looked like it belonged in a history book. For generations, the Winthrop family had been the closest thing the town had to royalty. They owned textile mills, donated to the library, and always showed up at the annual Harvest Festival in crisp suits and elegant dresses. But after the last patriarch passed away 2 winters ago, the house had sat empty, its windows dark, its gardens overgrown. Now a moving truck rumbled up the gravel drive. Workers in hard hats carried boxes inside, and standing on the front steps, arms crossed, watching everything with calm focus, was the Winthrop daughter. She hadn't been back since college. Rumor was she'd been living in Europe, Paris maybe, or Barcelona, working in art galleries or something fancy like that. She looked different now. Less like the girl who used to ride her bike down Main Street with scraped knees, and more like someone who'd seen the world and come back with quiet confidence in her eyes. She wore simple clothes, jeans, a sweater, boots caked with mud, but carried herself like she owned the air around her. Which technically she did. The Winthrop holdings still owned half the land in Cedar Hollow. The town buzzed. At the diner over coffee and pie, people speculated. Was she selling the estate? Turning it into a bed and breakfast? Starting some kind of museum? No one knew. She kept to herself. spoke only to contractors and delivery drivers, and never lingered in town longer than necessary. When she did come down the hill, she walked fast, eyes forward, as if the past was something she was trying to outrun. But she wasn't cold, just careful. She'd lost her father suddenly, a heart attack in his study, and the weight of his legacy pressed on her shoulders like a stone cloak. The estate wasn't just a house. It was a symbol, a responsibility, a ghost of everything she'd tried to leave behind. She'd come back not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Someone needed to decide what to do with it all. The land, the memories, the crumbling walls that whispered stories no one else remembered. One of those walls stood at the edge of the property near the old rose garden. It was made of local fieldstone, mortared together over a century ago. Beautiful but fragile. Recent rains had soaked the ground, and the excavation work for a new drainage system had weakened its foundation. Cracks spiderwebbed along its surface. Still, no one thought much of it. Old walls crack. That's what old things do, she, however, noticed. She'd spent hours walking the grounds, sketching plans in a leather notebook, trying to decide what to restore and what to let go. That morning, she'd come out early before the crew arrived to measure the wall herself. She needed exact dimensions for the architect. She stepped carefully over the wet grass, notebook in one hand, tape measure in the other. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming lilacs. For a moment, she forgot about the weight of her name. She was just a woman in a quiet place doing a simple task. She didn't see the shift in the stones, didn't hear the low groan of earth giving way beneath them. 1 second, she was reaching to mark a measurement. The next, the ground beneath her feet trembled. Then, crack. A section of the wall, about 6 feet wide, leaned forward like it was bowing. Stones tumbled. Dirt poured. She stumbled back, but her foot caught on a root. She fell hard, her leg pinned under a fallen slab. Pain shot up her calf. She tried to move, but the weight held her fast. Her phone slipped from her pocket and shattered on a rock. "Help!" she called, her voice swallowed by the thick morning fog. No one answered. The crew wouldn't arrive for another hour. The house was empty. She was alone. Panic rose in her chest. She pulled at her leg, but the stone didn't budge. Above her, the rest of the wall groaned again, dust sifting down like gray snow. If it came down all at once, she wouldn't just be trapped, she'd be buried. Back in town, he was finishing his coffee. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening. He'd planned to spend the day sorting scrap metal he'd collected from an abandoned lot on the edge of town. Copper wire, old pipes, anything he could sell for a few dollars. It wasn't much, but it was honest work, and it kept his hands busy. He slung his bag over his shoulder and started walking the long way around, past the edge of the Winthrop property. He usually avoided the estate. It felt like trespassing, even on the public road. But today, something made him glance up the hill. That's when he heard it. A muffled cry. Not loud, but sharp with fear. He stopped, listened. Nothing. Then again, "Help!" He didn't think. He ran. His back screamed with every step, but he ignored it. Years of pain had taught him to move through discomfort. He scrambled up the muddy slope, boots slipping, heart pounding. When he crested the rise, he saw her, trapped, pale-faced. One leg pinned under stone, eyes wide with terror. "Don't move," he said, his voice rough but calm. She looked at him, confused for a second. This man in worn boots and a faded flannel shirt, his face lined with years and worry. Then relief flooded her features. "The wall, it's still unstable," she gasped. He scanned the scene fast. Years of carpentry had trained him to read structures like books. He saw the tension in the remaining stones, the way the earth was shifting. If he pulled her out carelessly, the whole thing could collapse on top of them both. He spotted a fallen timber nearby, probably left over from the drainage work. He grabbed it, wedged one end under the slab pinning her leg, and used it as a lever. With a grunt, he lifted just enough to slide his hands under her calf. "On 3, he said. "Pull your leg free fast." She nodded, teeth clenched. He counted. She yanked her leg out. He dropped the timber and grabbed her arm, hauling her backward just as the rest of the wall gave way with a thunderous crash. Stone, dirt, and splintered wood exploded where she'd been lying seconds before. They landed in the wet grass, breathing hard. Rain started again, soft, misty drops that cooled their flushed faces. For a long moment, neither spoke. And she's teared at the wreckage, shaking. He sat up slowly, wincing as his back protested, but checking her over with quiet concern. "You okay?" he asked. She looked at him, really looked. Saw the calloused hands, the tired eyes, the quiet strength in his posture. "Yeah," she whispered. "Thanks to you." He just nodded like it was nothing. Like saving someone's life was as ordinary as fixing a leaky faucet. She started. "Don't worry about it," he said, already standing, offering her a hand. "You should get checked out." She took his hand. It was rough but steady. As they walked down the hill together, slowly, carefully, he didn't say much. She didn't push. But something had shifted. Not just between them, but in the quiet rhythm of Cedar Hollow itself. Because for the first time in years, someone had truly seen him, and he, in turn, had seen her, not as the Winthrop heiress, but as a person in need. The town wouldn't know the full story until later. But that morning, under a soft spring rain, two broken people, one rich in name but heavy with grief, the other poor in pocket but rich in quiet courage, took their first steps toward something neither expected: connection. And in a place like Cedar Hollow, where everyone thought they knew everyone else's story, that was the most surprising thing of all. The rain kept falling all afternoon, soft and steady, like the sky was trying to wash something clean. Back in town, people were just starting to hear whispers about what happened up at the Winthrop estate. A delivery driver saw the collapsed wall from the road. A neighbor walking her dog spotted two figures coming down the hill. One limping slightly, the other moving slow, like he was carrying more than just the weight of the day. By late morning, the story had already twisted into 3 different versions at the diner. One said the heiress had been attacked, another claimed it was a gas leak, and a third swore it was divine intervention. But the truth was quieter than all of that. She made it to the clinic with only scrapes and a deep bruise on her calf. The doctor wanted her to stay overnight for observation, but she refused. "I've got work to do," she said, voice firm, though her hands still trembled when she zipped up her jacket. The nurse gave her crutches and a bag of ice, and she walked out into the gray afternoon, leaning more on pride than strength. He didn't go to the clinic. He never did. Pain was something he lived with, not something he fixed. Instead, he went back to his garage, soaked through, mud caked on his boots. He peeled off his wet shirt, winced as he stretched his back, and sat on the edge of his narrow cot. His hands shook, not from cold, but from the rush of what had just happened. He hadn't moved that fast in years. His spine felt like it had been twisted in a vice, but he didn't care. She was safe. That was enough. Still, something about the morning clung to him. Not just the danger, but the look in her eyes when he pulled her free. Grateful, yes, but also surprised. Like she hadn't expected anyone to come. Like she'd forgotten people still did things like that. He shook his head and lit the small stove to boil water for tea. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose pane in the window. He thought about going to bed early, but then, just after dusk, there was a knock. He opened the door to find her standing there, crutches under her arms, hair damp from the drizzle, holding a paper bag. She looked out of place, like a painting hung in the wrong room, but her expression was steady. "I brought soup," she said simply. "And painkillers. The good kind." He hesitated. Letting someone into this space felt like letting them see the inside of his ribs. But he stepped aside. She didn't look around like she was judging. She just hobbled to the small table, set the bag down, and carefully lowered herself onto the only chair. "I didn't know how you took your tea," she said, pulling out 2 containers, "so I got plain broth. Hope that's okay?" "It's fine," he said, voice softer than he meant it to be. They sat in silence for a while, steam rising between them. Rain tapped on the roof. A car passed on the road, its headlights sweeping across the wall like a lighthouse beam. "Why did you come up the hill today?" she finally asked. He stirred his soup. "Heard you calling, but you didn't have to run. You didn't even know it was me." He looked at her then. Would it have mattered if it was someone else? She thought about that. "No," she admitted. "But most people wouldn't have run," he shrugged. "Most people don't walk past that lot every Tuesday." She smiled a little. It was the first real smile he'd seen on her face. They talked then, not about the wall, not about money or the past, but about small things. She told him she'd forgotten how quiet Cedar Hollow could be after midnight. He told her about the owl that nested in the oak tree every spring. She laughed when he described how it hooted like it was scolding the moon. He hadn't heard himself laugh in years. When she left an hour later, she left the extra painkillers on the table. He didn't take them, but he kept the empty soup container on the shelf for days, like a reminder that kindness could still find you, even in a garage with a leaky roof. The next morning, the local paper ran a short piece. Heiress rescued after estate wall collapse. It mentioned a local handyman but didn't name him. Still, people started connecting the dots. By lunchtime, a reporter from the county news station showed up at the garage with a camera and a microphone. He shut the door in their face, but the attention didn't stop. A florist dropped off a bouquet with a note from a grateful town. A hardware store owner left a gift card on his doorstep. Kids pointed at him in the street and whispered, "That's the guy who saved her." He hated it. Not because he didn't appreciate the gesture, but because it turned something simple into a spectacle. He hadn't saved her for thanks. He'd done it because it was right. That was all. She, meanwhile, threw herself into work. She hired engineers to inspect every wall, every foundation, every old tree on the property. She canceled the drainage project until a full safety review was done. She even called a meeting with the town council to discuss historic preservation grants. People noticed the change. She wasn't just restoring a house anymore, she was trying to protect something. One afternoon, she came down the hill again. This time, no crutches. Just a folder under her arm and a determined look. She found him fixing a broken step on Mrs. Callahan's porch. He didn't stop working when she approached. He just nodded. "I've been thinking," she said, standing a few feet away, hands in her coat pockets. "About what you said, that anyone would have done it." He hammered a nail. "Wouldn't they?" She was quiet for a moment. "I used to believe that too. Before I left town, I thought people were basically good, that we'd look out for each other. But the longer I was away, the more I saw how easy it is to walk past someone in trouble. How convenient it is to pretend you didn't see." He paused, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Maybe it's not about being good. Maybe it's about remembering." "Remembering what?" "That we're all just people. Not rich or poor, not important or invisible. Just people who might need help one day." She looked at him like he'd handed her a key to a door she didn't know existed. A few days later, she made an announcement at the town hall meeting. She was donating part of the estate's east lawn, the flat sunny patch near the old greenhouse, to build a community workshop. It would offer free classes in carpentry, masonry, and home repair. Open to anyone. No questions asked, the room buzzed. Some folks clapped. Others frowned, skeptical. "Who's going to run it?" Someone called out. She turned, calm and clear. "The man who saved my life." All eyes swung toward the back of the room where he stood near the door, having slipped in quietly just to listen. He froze, his face burned. He wanted to disappear, but she walked over, not with fanfare, but with quiet certainty. "You know how to build things that last," she said, low enough that only he could hear. "Now help us build something that matters." He didn't say yes right away. He went home and stared at the walls of his garage for hours. He thought about his father teaching him to plane wood straight. He thought about the kids in town who dropped out of school because they didn't see a future. He thought about how empty his hands felt when he wasn't creating something. The next morning, he went to the estate. She was in the library sorting through old blueprints. "I'll do it," he said. She looked up, eyes bright. "On one condition." He braced himself. "You don't call it charity. You call it partnership." He nodded. That he could live with. Work began slowly. They cleared the site together, her in work gloves, him with a crowbar and a stubborn limp. Neighbors stopped by, curious. A few offered to help. Teenagers from the high school looking for volunteer hours showed up with shovels. He taught them how to level ground, how to read a tape measure, how to respect the tools. One boy, maybe 16, kept hanging around after everyone left. "My dad used to build stuff," he said one evening, kicking at a pile of gravel, before he got sick. "I never learned." He handed the boy a hammer. "Then let's start today." As the foundation took shape, something else shifted in Cedar Hollow. People started talking to him. Not about the rescue, but about their leaky roofs, their wobbly stairs, their dreams of fixing up an old barn. He listened. He offered advice. Sometimes he'd show up with his toolbox and fix it himself, refusing payment but accepting a cup of coffee or a slice of pie. She watched all this from a distance, careful not to interfere. But every Friday she brought lunch for the crew, sandwiches, fruit, homemade cookies. She never made a shay. Ow of it. She just set the basket down and sat on a stump, eating quietly while listening to the hammering and laughter. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, she found him sanding a beam for the workshop's frame. The air smelled of pine and warm earth. "You know," she said, leaning against a post, "I used to think this town was stuck in the past, that nothing ever changed." He ran his hand over the smooth wood. "Places don't change. People do." She smiled. "Yeah, they do." Weeks passed. The walls rose. The roof went on. Inside, they built workbenches from reclaimed timber, hung pegboards for tools, painted the walls a soft, calming blue. He insisted on wide windows so natural light could flood in. "People work better in the light," he said. She didn't argue. She just nodded and ordered extra glass. Then came the day the town council approved the final permits. There was a small celebration, just the workers, a few neighbors, and a cake someone baked in the shape of a hammer. As people laughed and took photos, he stood off to the side watching. He felt full, not with pride exactly, but with purpose. Later, as the crowd thinned, she walked over. "You did good," she said. "No," he replied. "We did." She looked at the building, then at him. "You know, my father always said the Winthrops owed this town more than money. He said we owed it our time, our attention, our care. I never understood what that meant until now." He didn't say anything. He just handed her a paintbrush. "Help me with the sign?" She took it. Together they painted the words above the door. Cedar Hollow Workshop. Building skills, building community. It wasn't grand. It wasn't fancy. But it was real, and in a town that had forgotten how to hope, that was enough. But the real surprise, the thing that would stun everyone, was still coming. Because while the workshop was being built, she'd been working on something else in secret. Something that would change not just his life, but the soul of the whole town. She just hadn't told him yet. And when she did, it wouldn't be with a speech or a ceremony. It would be with a letter, a handshake, and a quiet promise that the work they'd started together was only the beginning. For now, though, they had sawdust on their boots, calluses on their hands, and the deep, quiet satisfaction of building something that would outlast them both. And in the soft light of a Cedar Hollow evening, that felt like everything. The workshop opened on a Saturday in early June, the kind of morning where the air smells like cut grass and warm bread. People came, not in crowds, but steadily, like a slow tide. Some were curious. Some were skeptical. A few just wanted to see if the rumors were true, that the Winthrop heiress and the broke carpenter had really built something together, something meant for everyone. Inside, the space was clean and bright. Workbenches lined the walls, each one labeled with a student's name. Tools hung in neat rows, hammers, chisels, levels, saws, each one donated or repaired by hand. In the corner, a small library held books on woodworking, plumbing, even basic electrical work. A chalkboard listed the week's classes: how to fix a leaky faucet, building a bookshelf from scratch, reading blueprints for beginners. He stood near the door, arms crossed, watching. He didn't wear a suit or a badge, just his usual flannel shirt, jeans, and boots. But something about him had changed. His shoulders weren't hunched anymore. His eyes didn't dart away when someone looked at him. He'd stopped being the man people walked past. Now they stopped to talk. A woman with tired eyes and paint-stained hands approached. "My son's in the youth program," she said. "He hasn't smiled like this in months." He nodded. "He's got good hands. Natural feel for the wood." She blinked fast, like she was holding back tears. "Thank you," she whispered, and walked away before he could reply. That was the thing about the workshop. It wasn't just about nails and lumber. It was about dignity, about giving people a chance to make something with their own hands and say, "I built that." In a town where jobs had dried up and hope felt like a luxury, that meant more than anyone had expected. She stayed in the background that day. She didn't give a speech or cut a ribbon. She just filled coffee pots, restocked paper towels, and listened. She watched teenagers who used to loiter downtown now measure boards with focus. She saw retired men teach young fathers how to sharpen a chisel. She watched a single mom proudly show off a birdhouse she'd built for her daughter's birthday. At one point, she found him outside, sitting on the steps, sipping from a dented thermos. "You look tired," she said, sitting beside him. "Good tired," he replied. "The kind that means you did something." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the hum of conversation and the soft tap of hammers inside. "You know," she said after a while, I used to think giving money was enough. Write a check, feel good, move on, but this is different. Because it's real, he said. You can't fake sawdust. You can't pretend a shelf is straight when it's crooked. Here, you earn what you get, she smiled. Yeah, you do. Over the next few weeks, the workshop became part of the town's rhythm. Kids came after school. Adults showed up on weekends. Even the high school started sending students for credit. He taught most of the classes himself, but he also brought in others. A retired plumber, a tile setter, a woman who'd run a hardware store for 30 years. Everyone had something to offer, but not everyone was happy. At the diner one morning, 2 men at the counter muttered over their coffee. He's getting special treatment, one said, just because he pulled her out of some dirt. Next thing you know, he'll be running the whole town, the other grumbled. Their voices carried. A few heads turned, but no one defended him, not out loud. That was the quiet cruelty of small towns. People wouldn't say nasty things to your face, but they'd let them float in the air like smoke, hoping you'd choke on them. He heard the rumors. Of course he did. Cedar Hollow was too small for secrets, but he didn't respond. He just kept showing up, kept teaching, kept fixing what was broken. One afternoon, a boy in the youth program, maybe 14, all elbows and nervous energy, stayed late. He was sanding a cutting board, but his movements were jerky, distracted. You okay? He asked, leaning against the workbench. The boy shrugged. My uncle says this place is a joke. Says you're just using it to get close to her. To get rich. He didn't flinch. He picked up a piece of sandpaper and started smoothing a rough edge on a shelf. What do you think? The boy looked down. I think you helped me build something I can give my mom for her birthday. And she cried when I showed her the plans. He nodded. Then that's all that matters. The boy went back to sanding. A few minutes later, he said quietly, I told my uncle he's wrong. He didn't say anything, but he handed the boy a finer grit of sandpaper. Use this for the final pass. Makes it silky. That night she called him, not to talk about the workshop, but to ask if he'd come to the estate. There's something I want to show you, she said. He walked up the hill again, this time under a sky full of stars. Fireflies blinked in the garden. The house glowed with warm light from inside. She met him on the porch. No crutches now. No hesitation. Just a calm certainty in her step. I've been going through my father's things, she said, leading him into the library. Old ledgers, letters, property records. He kept everything. She pulled a thick folder from a drawer. Did you know the Winthrops used to run an apprenticeship program back in the 1940s? Paid kids to learn trades, gave them room and board, helped them start their own businesses. He shook his head. No one talks about that. Because it stopped, she said. When the mills closed, they cut everything. My grandfather said there wasn't money for extras. But my father, he kept notes. Plans to bring it back. He just never got the chance. She handed him a sheet of paper. It was a sketch, a larger version of the workshop with dorm-style housing attached, a classroom, even a small kitchen. At the bottom, in faded ink, was a note. Skills are the true inheritance. He stared at it for a long time. You want to rebuild this? I want to finish what he started, she said. But I can't do it alone. And I don't want to. This town needs more than a building. It needs a future. He looked at her, really looked. Saw not just the heiress, but the daughter carrying her father's unfinished dream. Saw the same quiet determination he'd seen the day she stood in his garage with soup. Okay, he said. Let's do it. They spent the next month planning. They met with teachers, counselors, even the local community college. They applied for grants, wrote proposals, and held town meetings. Some people were excited. Others rolled their eyes. Another rich person's pet project, someone muttered at the post office. But the workshop kept running, and every week more people showed up, not just to learn, but to belong. Then came Founders Day. It was Cedar Hollow's biggest event of the year, a parade, a pie contest, live music in the square. Everyone came. Even people who'd moved away came back for it. This year the workshop had a booth. Kids sold birdhouses and cutting boards they'd made. A group of retirees demonstrated how to reupholster a chair. He stood near the back, watching when she walked up beside him. You ready? She asked. For what? She didn't answer. Just smiled. Later, during the mayor's speech, she stepped up to the microphone. The crowd quieted. Some people clapped politely. Others just waited for the pie judging to start. I came back to Cedar Hollow thinking I'd sell the estate and leave. She began, her voice clear and calm. I thought the past was too heavy to carry. But then something happened. She paused, looked out at the crowd. A man I barely knew ran up a muddy hill in the rain and pulled me out from under a falling wall. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't even want thanks. He just did what was right. People turned, looking for him. He kept his head down, but he could feel their eyes. That act changed me, she continued. It reminded me that this town isn't just brick and stone. It's people. And people deserve a chance, she took a breath. So today I'm announcing the Winthrop Legacy Initiative. We're expanding the workshop into a full vocational training center, with housing for students, certified instructors, and partnerships with local businesses. And it will be run by the man who taught me that courage isn't loud, it's quiet, steady, and kind. The crowd erupted. Not everyone cheered, some still frowned, but most clapped. Hard. A few whistled. Teenagers from the workshop jumped up and down, grinning. He stood frozen, heart pounding. He wanted to disappear. But then she walked over, not with fanfare, but with a quiet nod. You don't have to say anything, she whispered. Just stand with me. So he did. And in that moment, under the summer sun, with the smell of popcorn and fresh-cut grass in the air, something shifted in Cedar Hollow. Not because of money or fame, but because one broken man and one grieving woman chose to build something together. After the event, as people milled around, a woman approached him, older, with silver hair and kind eyes. She'd lived in town her whole life. My husband was a carpenter, she said. He always said the best builders aren't the ones with the fanciest tools. They're the ones who care about what they're making. She handed him a small wooden box. Inside was a set of hand-carved chisels worn smooth with use. He'd want you to have these, she said. He held them like they were made of glass. Thank you, she patted his arm. No, thank you. That night he sat in his garage, the chisels laid out on his workbench. Moonlight streamed through the window. He thought about the wall that fell, the soup in the rain, the sound of hammers in the workshop, the look in that boy's eyes when he held his first finished project. He wasn't invisible anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that was okay. But the biggest surprise, the one that would truly stun the town, was still coming. Because while everyone was celebrating the new center, she'd been working on something even deeper. Something that wouldn't just honor the past but secure the future. She just hadn't told him yet. And when she did, it wouldn't be with applause or headlines. It would be with a quiet act of trust that would change everything. For now, though he closed his eyes, listened to the crickets outside, and let himself believe that maybe, after all these years, he was exactly where he was meant to be. Summer deepened in Cedar Hollow, and with it, the rhythm of the workshop settled into something steady and sure. Mornings began with the sound of saws warming up, the smell of coffee brewing in the small kitchen nook, and the soft shuffle of boots on sawdust-covered floors. What had started as a hopeful experiment was now a living thing, breathing, growing, pulling people in like a hearth on a cold night. He no longer slept in the garage. Not because he'd moved somewhere fancier, but because the town had quietly, stubbornly refused to let him stay there. One evening, after a long day teaching a class on framing walls, he returned to find his few belongings packed neatly in boxes on the porch. Taped to the top was a note. The old Miller place is empty. Keys are with the post office. Don't argue. The Miller house, a small white clapboard home on the edge of town, had been vacant for years. But someone had fixed the porch steps. Someone else had mowed the lawn. And when he opened the door, the electricity worked, the stove was clean, and a quilt was folded on the bed. No one claimed credit. They didn't have to. He knew. He moved in the next day, still kept his tools in the workshop, still walked to work every morning. But now he had a kitchen with real cabinets, a bathtub that held hot water, and a window that looked out on a backyard full of wildflowers. It felt strange at first, like wearing shoes that fit after years of walking barefoot. But he got used to it, slowly. She visited less often now, not because she'd lost interest, but because she trusted him. She'd check in once a week, usually with a thermos of soup or a stack of grant applications she needed help reviewing. They'd sit at the workbench, papers spread out, talking through budgets and class schedules. Their conversations had settled into something easy, like two people who'd known each other forever, even though they'd only really known each other for months. One afternoon, while sorting through old estate records, she found something that made her pause. A faded contract from 1978, signed by her grandfather and a local contractor, his father. It was for the restoration of the manor's east wing. At the bottom, in careful script, was a note. Work completed ahead of schedule. Craftsmanship beyond expectation. A man of his word. She brought it to him the next day. He stared at the paper like it was a ghost. His father had never talked much about the Winthrop job. Just said it was good work. Fair pay. But seeing that note, written in the hand of the man who'd once owned half the county, made something tight in his chest loosen. He was proud of that job, he said quietly. Said it was the last big one he did before his hands gave out. She didn't say anything, just sat with him in the quiet. That night he dug out an old photo from a shoebox under his bed. It showed his father, younger than he'd ever known him, standing on the Winthrop porch holding a toolbox, smiling like he belonged. He'd never realized his father had stood on those same steps, built with those same hands long before the wall ever fell. The past wasn't just behind them. It was part of the foundation they were building now. As fall approached, the Legacy Initiative gained momentum. Contractors from neighboring towns started calling, asking if they could hire students from the program. A local builder offered apprenticeships. The community college agreed to give credit for completed courses. Even the skeptical voices in town began to soften. You couldn't argue with results, especially when one of the boys from the youth program fixed the mayor's porch railing, better than the paid handyman had. But the real test came when the first group of residential students arrived. They weren't kids. Most were in their 20s. People who'd lost jobs when the factory closed, single parents trying to learn a trade that couldn't be outsourced, veterans looking for structure and purpose. They moved into the newly renovated dorm wing, simple rooms, shared kitchen, a common area with a worn couch and a bookshelf full of donated paperbacks. He taught them the same way he'd taught the teenagers, with patience, high standards, and zero pity. Mistakes are fine, he'd say, but don't make the same one twice. That's how you learn. One woman, quiet and watchful, struggled with measuring. She'd been a cashier for 15 years and had never held a tape measure before. He stayed late with her 3 nights in a row, showing her how to read fractions, how to mark cleanly, how to trust her own eyes. On the 4th night, she built a perfect shelf, square, level, joints tight. She didn't say much, just handed him a cup of coffee and said, "Thanks for not giving up on me." He nodded. "You didn't give up on yourself. That's what matters." Meanwhile, she worked behind the scenes, handling the paperwork, the funding, the endless meetings with officials who still didn't quite understand what they were building. She turned down interviews, refused photo ops. "This isn't about me," she told a reporter who called. "It's about them." But the town hadn't forgotten the story that started it all. Every now and then someone would bring it up, usually over pie at the diner or while waiting in line at the hardware store. "Remember when he pulled her out from under that wall?" they'd say, shaking their heads like it was a miracle. He hated that part, not because it wasn't true, but because it made it sound like it was over, like the rescue was the end of the story. But to him it was just the beginning, the first brick in something much bigger. Then, one rainy October evening, a letter arrived. It came in a plain envelope, no return address, just his name and the workshop's address written in neat block letters. He opened it at the kitchen table, expecting a bill or a permit update. Instead, it was from a law firm in the city. His hands went cold. The letter explained that after a thorough review of old workplace injury claims sparked by a new state audit, his former employer had agreed to a full settlement. Not just for medical costs, but for lost wages, pain and suffering, and vocational rehabilitation. The amount was enough to clear every debt he'd carried for years. Enough to buy new tools, maybe even save for the future. At the bottom, in a separate paragraph, was a note. This resolution was facilitated by a private request from Ms. Winthrop. She asked that her involvement remain confidential. He read it 3 times. Then he just sat there staring out the window at the rain. He didn't call her that night. He needed to sit with it to let the weight of it settle. For so long he'd believed he was stuck, that the fall had sealed his fate. But someone had reached back into the past and fixed what was broken. Not with pity, but with quiet action. The next morning, he found her in the workshop office going over blueprints for a new addition. He didn't say anything at first. Just handed her the letter. She read it, then looked up, eyes wide. You weren't supposed to find out. I'm glad I did, he said. But you didn't have to do that. Yes, he said softly. I did, he shook his head. You've already given so much. This isn't giving, she said. It's making things right. My family's company worked with yours for decades. When your father got sick, they didn't help. When you got hurt, they buried the claim. That's not justice. This is just balance. He didn't argue. He just nodded. Because he understood now this wasn't charity. It was repair. Like fixing a crooked wall or a broken joint. You don't ignore the damage. You address it. You make it whole again. A few days later, he did something he hadn't done in 10 years. He walked into the licensing office and renewed his contractor's license. The clerk, an older man who remembered him from before, clapped him on the shoulder. About time, he said, smiling. That same week, the workshop held its first official graduation. It wasn't fancy, just a potluck dinner in the common room, folding chairs, and a handmade banner that read Cedar Hollow Builders, Class of 2024. But to the students it meant everything. Each one stood up and shared what they'd built, not just with wood and nails, but with their lives. One man said he'd gotten a job framing houses. Another said she was starting her own cabinet business. The quiet woman who'd struggled with measurements announced she'd been hired to teach basic carpentry at the community center. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't say much. Just looked at them and said, "You didn't just learn how to build things. You learned how to believe in yourselves. That's the real skill." Afterward, she pulled him aside. "There's one more thing," she said. He braced himself. "What now?" She handed him a folder. Inside were property deeds, financial statements, and a trust agreement. "I've transferred the land under the workshop and the Miller house to you," she said. "Not as a gift, as a stewardship. The trust will fund the center for the next 20 years, but you'll manage it. You decide who teaches, who gets in, what gets built." He stared at the papers like they were on fire. "I can't accept this." "You already have," she said gently. "Every day you show up. Every time you stay late to help a student. Every time you choose to believe in this town, even when it didn't believe in you. You've earned this." He looked around the room at the students laughing, the teachers packing up tools, the walls they'd built together. This wasn't just a building. It was a promise, and promises needed someone to keep them. "Okay," he said finally, "but only if you stay involved. This was your father's dream too," she smiled. "I'm not going anywhere." As the night wound down and people drifted home, he stood alone in the workshop for a moment. The lights were off, but moonlight came through the big windows, casting long shadows over the workbenches. He ran his hand over the edge of one, smooth, solid, real. He thought about the wall that fell, about the rain, the fear, the split-second choice to run toward danger instead of away. He never imagined that moment would lead here to a home, a purpose, a future built not on luck but on care. And in that quiet space, surrounded by the ghosts of sawdust and the echoes of hammers, he finally let himself feel it. Peace. But Cedar Hollow wasn't done being surprised, because the true ending, the one that would stun the entire town, was still waiting in the wings. Not with fanfare, not with drama, but with a simple act of trust that would echo for generations. He just didn't know it yet. And when he did, it wouldn't change his life. It would complete it. The first snow of winter dusted Cedar Hollow just days before the grand opening of the expanded Legacy Center. It wasn't a storm, just a soft, quiet fall that turned the rooftops white and made the old oaks look like they were wearing lace. People woke up early to shovel walks and check on neighbors, but there was a different kind of energy in the air this morning. Not just holiday cheer, but something deeper, anticipation. The town had watched the workshop grow from a hopeful idea into a real place where lives changed. Now, with the new dorm wing finished, the classroom expanded, and the old greenhouse converted into a design studio, it was ready to become what it was always meant to be, a home for second chances. He arrived before dawn, boots crunching on fresh snow, breath curling in the cold air. He didn't need to be there so early, but he wanted to see it alone one last time before the crowd came. Inside, everything was ready. Benches polished. Tools hung in perfect order. A new sign above the main door read, Cedar Hollow Legacy Center, Skills, Community, Future. He ran his hand along the edge of a workbench he'd built with his own hands, the wood smooth and warm even in the chill. It felt strange to think that this place now belonged to him, not just to use but to protect, to guide. He still wasn't sure he deserved it. But every time a student thanked him, every time someone said, "This place saved me," he remembered it wasn't about deserving. It was about showing up. By 9 o'clock, the square outside was filling up. Families came with thermoses and mittens. Kids pressed their noses against the windows. Even folks who'd once muttered about handouts showed up, curious, maybe even a little hopeful. The mayor arrived in a wool coat, shaking hands like it was election day. Local news set up a camera near the steps. She came just before 10, walking up the path with no fanfare, just a scarf wrapped around her neck and a quiet smile. She didn't wear fancy clothes, just boots, jeans, and a thick sweater. She'd insisted there be no speeches from her today. This is his moment, she'd told the planning committee. And she meant it. The ceremony began simply. The mayor said a few words about Cedar Hollow's spirit of resilience. A student from the first class spoke about how learning to build a shelf taught her she could rebuild her life. Then, to everyone's surprise, the mayor turned and handed a small wooden box to him. "By order of the town council," he said, voice thick with emotion, "we present you with the Cedar Hollow key to community service, the highest honor this town can give." The crowd clapped. Some whistled. A few wiped their eyes. He took the box, opened it. Inside was a key. Not real, of course, but carved from cherry wood, polished to a shine with the town's founding date etched on the side. He held it like it was sacred. Then he stepped up to the microphone. He wasn't a speechmaker. Never had been. But he looked out at the faces, the old, the young, the skeptical, the faithful, and he spoke from the heart. "I didn't save anyone that day," he began, voice rough but steady. "Not really. I just did what any of us would do if we saw someone in trouble. But what happened after, that's what matters." He paused, glancing at her. She nodded, eyes bright. "People keep calling me a hero, but heroes don't build shelves or fix faucets or stay late to help a kid read a tape measure. Regular people do that. Good people. People who believe that no one should be left behind." He looked around the room, at the walls they'd raised together, the benches they'd sanded, the dreams they'd nailed into place. "This center isn't mine," he said. "It's ours. It belongs to the single mom who learned to wire a lamp so she could work nights, to the veteran who found peace in the rhythm of a saw, to the teenager who finally believed he was good at something. This place is for anyone who's ever been told they don't matter." His voice dropped but carried in the quiet room. "The truth is, we're all broke in some way. Not just in money, but in hope, in trust, in belief. But when we help each other, when we build something together, we heal not just the wood, not just the walls, ourselves." The room was silent for a long moment. Then someone clapped. Then another. Soon the whole place was roaring, not with polite applause, but with real, raw gratitude. Afterward, people milled around eating cookies, touring the new spaces, hugging students and teachers. He stayed near the back, letting the moment breathe. But then she came over, holding an envelope. "This came yesterday," she said quietly. "I was going to wait, but I think today's the right time." He opened it. Inside was a letter from the same law firm, but this one was different, denser, more final. As he read, his breath caught. The trust wasn't just for 20 years. It was in perpetuity. The land, workshop, dorm, Miller House, even a strip of forest behind the estate, was now held in a community trust, with him as the lifetime steward. No one could sell it. No one could shut it down. It would always be a place for learning, for building, for belonging. And there was more. His old employer hadn't just settled the claim. They'd also restored his professional standing, issued a formal apology, and donated tools and materials to the center in his name, all arranged quietly months ago by her. But the real shock was at the bottom of the page. A clause, written in clear legal language. Upon the steward's passing, governance of the trust shall transfer to a board composed of Legacy Center graduates, ensuring the mission endures through those it has served. He looked up, stunned. "You planned this from the start." She shook her head. "Not me, my father. He wrote the first draft of this trust 10 years ago. He just never had the right person to give it to." She met his eyes. "Until you ran up that hill, he didn't cry." But his throat tightened like a vice. All this time he thought he was building something new. But really,